Awesome. Well, as I mentioned, we're going to be covering about what are called trauma-informed practices that can help with your team. And this is our first opportunity to interact to answer your question, Andrea. So on average in the United States, you can put in the chat or come off mute. How many of these adults had a traumatic childhood event, according to the data on United States adults? Not a lot of choices. Anybody want to take a guess?
I think it's 2 out of 3.
That is correct. On average, 2 out of every 3 adults in the United States has had what's called an ACE, or a traumatic childhood event. And we're going to talk about what that does to the brain later on. But I also want us to think about, for this next generation of workers, how many of them do you think had a traumatic childhood event?
All of them?
All of them. And so when we think about the impact that traumatic childhood events have on the brain, and we think about the future of our workforce, it becomes more apparent that understanding the impact of trauma and how it can show up at work becomes really imperative. Okay, so I did a slight introduction at the beginning, but my name is Dr. Alessandria Polizzi. As I said, I used to be the Chief People Officer for a very large multi-location veterinary practice organization here in the United States. That's my pug Lola, my pug-ish Lola. And I actually left my executive position to start this company, which focuses on helping workplaces like veterinary practices create healthy and psychologically healthy and safe workplaces. So that's me.
And I'm Coral Doherty. And as a registered veterinary technologist with 30 years in the field, I've realized that my passion is with workplace wellness and helping workplaces feel better at work and promoting a positive working environment. I've recently been awarded the Veterinary Visionaries Idea of the Year. And so a lot of other people must agree that it's an important thing to promote positive workplaces. And I'm working on helping these practices who want to improve their workplaces. And collaborating with Dr. Al has been amazing because she's a wealth of knowledge and she's leading the field with trauma informed communication. So I'm really excited that I get to collaborate with you, Dr. Al.
Oh, thank you, Coral. And Coral's in Canada. I'm in Boston. So this is a multinational presentation. We're global at this point. Okay,
We
so
are.
what are we going to accomplish? We're going to help you recognize how trauma can show up at work and what that looks like, identify actions you can take, and understand some reactions to avoid. Let me be really clear up front. The goal of this is not for you to understand other people's trauma. We are not getting into that business. It is for you to be informed about how trauma impacts the humans in your practices, both your clients and your coworkers, and how we can create new ways of working, and we can implement very specific tactics to help bridge from a trauma response to healthier behaviors in the workplace. It also will give us some skills for ourselves if we identify as somebody who has had traumatic experiences, which what did you say earlier, Coral? What percent of veterinary professionals
Are burnt out 76%.
Mhm.
And that to me is actually a little bit low as to what I'm experiencing as I'm working with different workplaces. But that was actually as of 2019 and the Merck Animal Health Study.
Okay. Yeah.
Mm.
So we know we have a problem. I am going to share in the chat a document called Safe Space. So if you are someone who, because we are talking about, big words like trauma, if you ever find yourself kind of having a reaction, needing to check out for a minute, this little workbook here will has activities that can help you just take a break. So feel free to use that, share that with your team, whomever. What was the study that you referenced, Coral, that you just?
The 2019 Merck Animal Health study by Merck, the veterinary, animal health company.
Yeah. Okay, so I wanted to make sure everyone has our safe space PDF, so we are good to go. Okay, so let's talk about what trauma is. So like I said, trauma is a big word, right? People get really uncomfortable when we talk about trauma, and specific things tend to come to mind. So I want to define what trauma means, and when we're talking about trauma, there are big T traumas and little t traumas, obviously, but a traumatic event is something where we feel like our physical or emotional safety is threatened and it exceeds our ability to cope with it effectively. So our trauma response increases when there's a lack of personal control or we're a compassionate witness. So things like secondary trauma or vicarious trauma occurs when we witness traumatic events impact other people. This is why this is an important topic for us to talk about in veterinary practices. So something may be, the same event may be traumatic for Coral and not traumatic for me, or vice versa. It may, from an outsider perspective, look really simple and not make sense to us until why it was traumatic. I like to share this example. When I was about probably 8 or 9, I almost drowned in like 2.5 feet of water. And when I didn't realize how shallow the water was until I stood up. But I could have died in that shallow water. This happens actually more frequently than we realize. So in the outside looking in, you'd be like, well, just stand up. Like, how is that a traumatic event? But it's that fear that my life was being threatened that created the traumatic response for me. So what happens when we experience trauma on the brain? What happens to the brain when we experience trauma? That's slightly different. And especially when we're in our development. So remember, our brains develop up until we're about 27 years old. And so any traumatic event that happens while our brains are being developed impacts specific parts of the brain. So our serotonin system is impacted, which can lead to decreased production of serotonin in our brains. Our sympathetic nerve system is impacted, which can cause us to have those trauma responses of fight, flight, freeze, fawn, as well as the need to be flawless and denial or forgetting. So the serotonin absence can cause us to have those big emotions, right? Unregulated or less easily regulated emotions. Sorry, I have one more person I need to admit. And then so that can happen. We have the fear response or the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And then the other thing that happens from a physical manifestation is that the impacts that can affect our physical body as a result of stress tend to be more highly activated. So things like increased migraines, increased incident of ulcers, increased physical injury can happen if we've experienced traumatic events while our brains are being developed. So long term, that can impact, obviously, our high risk of mental health issues, chronic disease because of that physical response, more risky behaviors because of the serotonin and the big emotions that can happen as a result of that, higher risk of injury. Also, there have been studies that show if we experience traumatic events while pregnant, we can pass that along to our children. And so generational trauma also is something to think about. And then there have been studies on fewer opportunities, and you'll see why, because of some of the behaviors that can happen when people have experienced trauma. Now, you don't have to have only experienced trauma as a child in order for it to impact you at work. There are lots of ways, especially in the work that happens within our practices, that you may encounter traumatic events. And I mean, my first week as a CPO, for veterinary hospitals, we had a client come and threaten violence on a practice. And so these are things that can happen, and they do happen. And so, you know, these are kind of more of our big T traumas. Another traumatic event could be bullying in the workplace or bullying even by a client. So these are things that can happen to us as working adults, and of course,
But lots of people can.
they impact us and how we show up at work. So this video comes from Scotland, and talks about this in a little more detail.
But lots of people continue to be affected by trauma, sometimes long after it happened.
For most of us, traumatic or adverse childhood experiences like these affect our body's response to stress, affecting our physical health as well as our mental health. The impact of trauma can also make it harder for us to learn and to realise our full potential.
One of the most worrying things about the experience of trauma is that it can make us avoid people and places, even if they are there to help, like doctors, teachers, social workers, carers, colleges,
councils, community centres, employers, advisors. Because most trauma experiences happen in relationships with other people, we can find it difficult to trust people or feel safe. And sometimes the way we react to help ourselves feel safe pushes people away and makes it even harder to get the help we need.
It's like our brains learn survival tricks to get us through the trauma at the time, like priming us for danger.
Making us run away.
shutting down when we feel upset.
It might look like we have a short fuse, like we're unfriendly, or we're just a bit absent.
Anything, however small, that reminds us of that trauma can set off our own unique trauma response to protect ourselves, making us avoid the people and places that we need the most. Like you. But there are things you can do to help me trust you enough so I feel safe and I don't shut down or avoid you. You can offer me a different relationship that doesn't remind me of the one I had when I was a kid. One where I feel safe, I feel empowered, and I have choice and control over what happens to me. One where we work together and I can trust you. This is called being trauma-informed in the way you work.
I was telling Coral I have to look away because that video gets me emotional every time. But I think it does a nice job of explaining what we're talking about.
It does, and one of the things that it makes me think about is unresolved trauma. And when people feel traumatized and they don't feel safe to talk about it, they leave and they go to another workplace. And so the experience is that we're having kind of a pooling of constant moving of people who are traumatized and not comfortable or trusting talking about it. And then we start to see increased absenteeism. Some of the early actual physical symptoms that we can see in our workplaces are people that start to become tardy or not, just procrastinating coming in, just not showing up to work as often as they're scheduled to. We see this conflict that happens where there's a lack of trust. And I know I've experienced it. And I'm sure that, if we've worked in veterinary medicine long enough, we will come across those explosive emotions where the straw broke the camel's back. The high turnover that we're seeing within our industry now may also be in a mindset of remembering that there is trauma, and it is hard sometimes to ask for help or reach out for help, and then protective mechanism may come in where we're seeming sound like somebody that we're actually not, someone who's detached or disengaged, but we're really just protecting ourselves. Jamie, I see you have your hand up. Do you have a question?
But yeah, I know, Coral, that you do quite a bit of work in the psychological safety area. So I just kind of wanted to, I'm now starting to see that connection just based on what you have recently shared. So my understanding is that when people are experiencing trauma and they don't feel comfortable talking about it, so they don't feel comfortable sharing their voice, would you say this is where promoting psychological safety in the workplace can help?
That's a really good question. I feel like I was saying earlier that the pendulum is swinging, and oftentimes where it lands is actually where the beginning starts. So psychological safety became a way of people feeling safe to be authentic, to be themselves at work,
Mhm.
and showing up and asking, feeling free to ask questions, challenge the status quo, maybe raise concerns or bring ideas to light without fear of retribution or retaliation.
Yeah.
And where trauma comes into all of this is if a person is traumatized or has tried something like that before, then psychological safety might be like a really foreign or very far reach for that person who has been traumatized and has not been able to overcome what has happened, what is their trigger, that's making them feel that it's really actually unsafe for them to start to share or challenge the status quo. So I
Mhm.
love the way that you asked that question, because I do feel like psychological safety is the beginning of curiosity. It'll lead you to being more mindful and more knowledgeable in dealing with trauma in the workplace and how to relate to your coworkers, how to notice it in your coworkers, and be reflective of what is actually happening versus, educating ourselves, but also the people we work with. That when we have a trauma informed perspective, and I think of it as putting a hat on, then we can see the way that people are acting at work, maybe from a perspective or from a beginning point of unresolved trauma that they have with them. I hope that helps.
Yeah, no, that's a great response. Thank you for clarifying that.
Okay, for sure. Thanks for asking the question.
Yeah, thank you. And another chance to interact here. If you have anybody on your team where you've seen these behaviors, will you put an exclamation point in the chat? I'm curious if anyone has experienced coworkers or members of their practice where they see these behaviors. Judy's seen it twice.
Yeah. You know what? I laugh, but it's really not funny. I only laugh because I feel like it's great that we're talking about it, and I'm really excited about this opportunity to share what trauma is like in our workplaces, because I think this is going to lead to healthier workplaces. Yeah, and I think what we're seeing right now, because we are only at the very beginning of talking about trauma-informed communications or perspectives in our workplace. A lot of what we are seeing in large volumes are things like avoiding, people who are threatened by authority and don't feel safe speaking up, the regulation of how do we figure this out? Like, how do we keep people accountable for coming to work or not coming to work, for being late, for being absent and leaving the extra work at the workplace that we are all dealing with, because we have someone who's traumatized who we don't know how to talk to, and they don't know how to talk to us either, because they have that shame or that fear, and they have that protective mechanism of being in survival mode, just that cope, that fight, flight, freeze, forget, fawn, and really not being true to themselves. And that's where psychological safety is a far reach for that person, because it's very difficult and unsafe for them to be their true and authentic self at work. So then, yeah, that tardiness and absenteeism is something that is really important to start tracking starting today.
Yeah, so speaking of why should you become trauma informed? And again, I said this at the beginning, I'm going to say it multiple times. This is not for you to become informed about people's trauma. This is for you to be informed about how people work and how you can create a better narrative for and create new stories, new neural pathways in how people interact. And as Coral mentioned, if I have some of these barriers holding me back, shame, difficulty with authority, feeling easily threatened, it's going to be a big leap to get to some of these things like engagement and psychological safety. And so, these behaviors will often challenge us as leaders. As you saw in the video, these are not like people aren't having a trauma response necessarily of like coming to work bringing muffins or like being really gregarious and fun. It's usually pretty negative, or it impacts and can trigger other people as well. So if we're aware of it, then we can choose to have maybe a different response that will be more helpful in the long run. So as I said, it's really about becoming informed about how humans can be impacted by traumatic events and how that can show up at work. And it can have, trauma could have happened all the way from childhood to, in the thick of it. But it is not, absolutely not about identifying, resolving, or inquiring about other people's trauma. In fact, that's not the space we want to reside in. What we want to do, as you saw in the video, is implement ways of behaving, ways of leading, ways of interacting that can change those stories and create healthier workplaces. So the concepts involved in trauma-informed leadership really build on the foundation that has been around for a while called trauma-informed care in human health care. And so, and in education. And so you can apply that from a leadership perspective as well. So the first step is to realize that trauma is a thing and it impacts humans, and both physiologically as well as behaviorally. So you're doing that right now. You are on step one, which is realization of identifying that trauma comes in many forms and it can impact people in many different ways. Not all trauma looks the same, behaves the same. It's all very individual. And change is not linear. So people will have good days and bad days. Mental health is on a continuum. We aren't either healthy or sick. We have good days, bad days. You may not have a mental health issue and still have a bad day, and still feel sad. So, and the other thing is that I think at least here in the US, we have this mindset that we can shut off our emotions because we're at work, or I shouldn't feel this way because I already know that this comes with the job. Our brains are going to do what our brains are going to do. Logic is not necessarily, we can't outthink our emotions. Our emotions, we are feeling creatures who also think. So the emotions will always get the upper hand. And so they will appear at work the same as they do everywhere else. Some of us are good at masking, but we still are having those emotions. So realizing we are emotional creatures, our brain is designed to protect us and keep us safe. And sometimes it does that in a very ineffective way because it's been around for 200,000 years and doesn't really understand today's context. So realization. Coral, anything you want to add on the realization step?
Well, I think when you start to realize where a person is coming from trauma, it's where you can start to think, you know what, is that their personality that, how are they're reacting in a way that's right? Like, do they seem a bit off, or does that seem unusual for them? Is it actually a response where they're trying to protect themselves, where there's a fear, a root of fear or a root of shame? And that is keeping that trauma informed perspective in mind. And for me, actually going back to the standard for psychological health and safety, the Canadian National Standard talks about 13 psychosocial factors that you need to feel psychologically safe and thrive and feel good at work. So oftentimes when I see somebody behaving in a way that doesn't seem quite right or just seems a little odd, I'll take those 13 factors and I'll run them through my head and I'll think to myself, is one of these where it's coming from. And one of the ones actually that relates specifically to trauma is psychological protection at work. And with that lens of psychological protection, is that employee feeling protected at work, psychologically protected at work, or not? And so then I could think of it from that perspective too, when I
Mhm.
realize that they're having that type of a reaction.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Mhm.
So you left in the middle of a meeting. So I have PTSD. I didn't know you served in the military. I didn't. But civilians get PTSD too. Well, yeah, I guess they could. What percentage of people with PTSD do you think are civilian and have never been in the military? I don't know, maybe 1%. Try somewhere between 92 and 96%, depending on which study you cite. Can hardly believe that. And why did you take a step back when I told you I had PTSD? No, I didn't. Yes, you did. I watched for it. It's the most common reaction I get other than people thinking I was in the military. Well, it's just that people with PTSD are often violent, have anger issues. Well, yes. Did you know that PTSD is actually an anxiety disorder? People think it's an anger disorder because of how it's been portrayed in TV and movies. And anger and violence can be symptoms. It's one of the least common manifestations, and it usually only comes out after all other emotional expressions have been exhausted, and the person still feels trapped in the situation that's triggered them. So how does a civilian get PTSD? Well, some of the most common causes are sexual harassment and assault, and of course there's domestic abuse, which can be either emotional or physical or both. But most people don't realize how common it is caused by toxic work environments with unsupportive HR departments.
Yes, that's true, Andrea. They may not necessarily know that they're reacting to prior trauma. That's very common. And I like to have that video up because one of the areas I think to pay attention to is that there have been studies on how people are impacted by natural disasters. And so one study in particular looked at 64,000 survivors of natural disasters, things like the tsunami in Indonesia, the earthquake in Mexico City, September 11th here in the United States. And what they saw was on average about 40% of people who experienced those natural disasters had post-traumatic stress symptoms up to 2 years afterwards. So taking that knowledge, and now let's look at things like climate change and a pandemic. Research, at least a recent research, has shown that about 35% of the US population, at least in the UK, has post-traumatic stress symptoms following COVID. And so these things can manifest more and more because we are continuing to face existential crisis with climate change and now with AI, as well as other things that we can experience vicariously through global actions, the issues we have with domestic violence, etc. So there are lots of things that can happen that can create those symptoms.
And certainly in vet med, I know we are in a high stress profession, and we may actually have a higher exposure to situations that may cause PTSD. And I think some people, I think someone had mentioned it, may not be, they themselves may not even be aware that they are traumatized. But if we are sensitive to thinking that we are in a high stress profession where we do have a lot of trauma that happens, if we have that mindset to reflect and be able to be mindful of the fact that when we see something that doesn't seem quite right, that we can approach it from a trauma perspective, um, just slow and um, removing the biases, of course. Yeah, that might prevent you. And I think the one of the big things is stigma, where people who are feeling uneasy that they don't even know necessarily why, but they don't trust people at work or people in positions of authority. That the stigma is there, and unfortunately, it's quite historic and generational within veterinary medicine. That stigma is how we have dealt with this problem. The stigma is don't talk about it, and then it'll go away, and we don't have to deal with it. Well, we know this isn't working, and that's why everybody's here is to reflect and notice that we can do better, and we will do better. Slowly but surely, we'll learn.
I'm curious from the group, you know, what what do you think may cause people to become triggered in our practices?
I know, yeah, overwhelm.
Absolutely.
Yeah, when there's just too many multitasks, too many simultaneous things happening all at once, and you're worried that one of them is going to fail. You're going to forget one, right? And clients, yeah, for sure. Yeah,
So when
those
I taught,
clients. Mhm.
yeah, those clients, a distressed team member, I was talking, when I taught a class, I taught a resiliency class to veterinary practice, and one of the veterinarians said, um, I can never make a mistake. Because if I make a mistake, a pet could die. The thing is, as humans, we are going to make mistakes. So that cognitive dissonance of I can't make a mistake, but as a human, we are flawed and will make mistakes. That creates this tension that is just palatable. And I know for her, it was very damaging for her because of her fear of making a mistake. And the belief that she can't. And mistakes aren't great. We don't love that. We'd like to put you know, processes in place to prevent them. But as humans, after she made that comment, I went and researched it because I know perfectionism is an example of a bias that we would prevent us from even allowing ourselves to understand why we're responding the way we are. And one study showed that on average, humans make about 50 mistakes a day. And it depends on the day. And that can be everything from saying someone's name wrong to dropping something to forgetting what you were going to say, like, you know, small mistakes, but we will make mistakes. That is a given. We are flawed. And so that's another one. But yelling, distressed team member. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing.
Mhm.
Am I doing this one?
We were going to talk about
Yes, I'm doing this one.
about the examples of for me actually an example for me of something that can trigger trauma for me is actually it's the smell of garbage bags. And so every time I open a garbage bag, I think about the very first time I actually ever worked in a vet clinic when I was 12 and a hit by car came in.
Mm.
So that's what happens to me. That is my trigger is garbage bags. So I was really happy when Youth the Bag came along. Um, and garbage bags are going to go by the wayside. But that was my example. A workplace that I was helping, there was an anesthetic death on a preventative dental on a vet tech's dog. And so she was having a very hard time talking about the advantages of preventative dentals and had to work really hard to overcome that. So that was definitely PTSD or a trauma event for her. It was a trigger for her, and she's been able to overcome that. So those are my
So
examples.
I'd love to hear some examples from the group of things that that might trigger folks either in your practice or maybe you personally experienced. As I said, I taught this earlier today. Some examples came of a specific, so this person had worked for a very abusive boss, and that boss had a specific ring on their phone. And so whenever they hear that ring out in public, that anxiety comes up. I had actually a sheriff in our practice in our class today was sharing about the sound of a text ding because he had a boss who would text nonstop and it would cause a reaction. I've heard about hand sanitizer and the smell of hand sanitizer can cause triggers. Anybody in the chat want to share or come off mute and share an example of something that could potentially be a trigger in your practice?
I know another one for me is working with passive aggressive people. I really have a lot of trouble with passive aggressive people. And I see the worst side of myself actually when I do that. So yes, that's
And
another example.
it could be a, you know, the way the appearance of somebody or a smell, so many things. Being micromanaged, yeah, but like tactical physical things can cause these triggers to occur.
Whenever the word
Suicide.
okay.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm. Yeah. I think in those situations just to recognize that that person, might be triggered by that those situations, that they've maybe something has happened and something has caused their trigger, that they're not reacting rationally. Yeah. So trauma informed behaviors, and being mindful of our response to those situations and asking them, how are you doing? How
Mm-hmm.
are you feeling? Are you okay?
Yeah, so I want to talk about this one that Tracy shared. I think it's a good example to talk about. So we realized that trauma is pretty common. We reflected on how this could show up in our practices, but recognize also the role that we as leaders can play, especially if you consider the impact that or the potential cause of trauma could be with positions of authority. But I want to use this example, Tracy, as to point something out. What we're talking about isn't that, oh, well, we're just going to have to cut out all these things because they might trigger people. It isn't that actually. What we want to be able to do is to recognize this person says that they don't, that the word suicide triggers them. Well, just like I did with you, well, if you feel triggered, what are your coping mechanisms? What are your self-soothing mechanisms? Because we still have to talk about this topic, right? So it is about co-creating, and they even talked about that in the video about how do we co-create a different narrative. How do we empower people to be able to come up with different ways of responding? Avoidance is not always the best response, or even an option. And so, and we kind of tend to have this binary thought process of, if I can't eliminate the problem, then people are just going to have to suck it up. And there's a huge continuum of options between get rid of it and ignore it. So what we're trying to talk about is how do we create a way that we still get the work done, but we can do it in healthy ways. So thank you, Marie, for sharing that about the shame. Um, yes, it's working with instead of avoiding. Yes, Tracy. And I think that this is what could be, as things like trauma and PTSD are becoming more kind of known and talked about. Psychological safety is a good example. Misinformed people will use it kind of like a weapon. Well, this traumatizes me, this is triggering me, and the only response is flight, right? Which is I can't handle it, or it makes me upset. So that's a trauma response, but that still doesn't change the need of the business. So again, it's about coming up with ways and reflecting and recognizing potential options for how we can handle that differently. Okay, so what I want you to think about now is yourself, right? Because sometimes, unfortunately, as leaders, we're the trigger. And rightly so, because they're doing stuff that's making us mad or making us upset or triggering us, right? So when you see these things, I'd like to see your responses in the chat. If someone is constantly late or questions your authority, has emotional outbursts, people keep quitting, no one seems to want your help. Like they're quitting and they're saying how they're burned out. You try to help them, they reject it. or they seem distant or distracted, what are some ways that you respond when you see that? Love it, Jamie. Seek first to understand. You have to be in a place of calm and curiosity to start there. So that's a skill.
That's right. That's for sure.
That's a skill. Anyone here get irritated, annoyed, frustrated? That's okay. No judgment. Because as I like to say, if these things were, yes, always be curious. Yes, thank you, Tracy. I need a minute to reflect and then discuss. Thank you for that self-awareness. Because if these things were easy to respond to, like I said, if this was somebody, you know, making cupcakes, it might not be that hard, but these are difficult behaviors. And so when you're activated, curiosity is always the best place to start. I'm so excited to see that come up. I always say, when in doubt, start with a question. But when you may be so activated, you can't even think straight. So here are some tips for you as far as getting regulated, because one of the things that you can do as a leader is co-regulate, which we're going to talk about here in a second. And so you can't do that if you're not in a place of calm. So try to change your location. Even if you walk outside for 30 seconds, 15 seconds, it can make a difference. Notice where the feeling is in your body. Just pay attention to that. You can do an exercise where you notice your senses. This is a great calming technique. Another one is just changing the temperature. Get something warm to drink, touch something cold. What we're trying to do here is we're trying to move from that part of our brain, the amygdala, which is in that heightened action, heightened fight, flight, freeze, fawn, forget, or flawless reaction, and move up here to a prefrontal cortex where we can actually do some long-term thinking. So these are just some examples of what to do when you see this behavior, and what you want to do is say, what is wrong with you? Or are you serious right now? Or whatever the thing is. Trust me, having been in HR, when it comes to veterinary, 250 veterinary practices, I have heard it all. So what we're going to do now is we're going to start building the skills so that when this happens in your practice, and based on your responses to some of the behaviors, it sounds like it's already potentially happening, you will know how to respond and what to do, because preparation is our friend. So you want to be prepared by having your go-tos, right? So have your go-to stress calming technique. What's your self-soothing technique? Have that ready to go. Hit that pause button, as Tracy mentioned. Really work on suspending judgment and getting curious. Again, love that. Share your calm. I'll talk about co-regulation here in a second. Give things space. Don't avoid them, but it's okay to take a pause. But one of the things that you can do ahead of time that helps prepare for all of this is to invest in the culture of your practice. Are you investing in people creating interpersonal connection? Do people have a sense of shared mission? Are you doing the soft stuff? Even if it feels like you're too busy, taking 5 minutes even just to do a check-in, or who wants to share a funny story, whatever. You can be as goofy as you want. These are the things that create the bond and the foundation that invite the trust to build, that invite the psychological safety to build. So really creating that sense of community and shared mission is cannot be overstated. Establishing that trust, and again, modeling that behavior, that's that co-regulation.
How can you improve your conflict presence as a leader? Practice trauma-informed leadership. Now, this was an absolute game changer for me, and I only wish I learned it sooner. So trauma-informed leadership is a mindset and a posture that both acknowledges and appreciates the emotional scars that people carry with them into the workplace. The easiest way to demonstrate trauma-informed leadership is to ask yourself a question anytime you engage with your direct reports. Typically, when someone around us is failing to meet expectations, our inclination is to think, what's wrong with that person, or what's their problem? But trauma-informed leaders instead ask the question, what happened to that person and who hurt them? People respond to stress, criticism, and pressure differently, and many times they respond from their past wounds. So, for example, an employee who never healed from being fired may seek excessive external validation. They might demonstrate low self-esteem and low self-confidence for fear of feeling like their future is always in jeopardy. Or someone who was bullied and decided to never be a victim again, they might overcorrect. So now they present as shut off and cold to other people because they made this deep inner vow to never be bullied or disrespected again. And typically as leaders, we address the problematic behavior, but trauma-informed leaders look for the source, not the symptom. Now, none of this excuses poor performance. That's the pushback I hear from people. None of this is a pass for not doing a job well. And I'm not telling you that you need to become a therapist. That's the other flex that I get. You know, as a leader, it's not your responsibility to fix people. In fact, if you think you need to fix someone, you're not using trauma-informed leadership, because that requires you to ask the wrong question. You're asking, what's wrong with them and how can I fix them? If you recognize that you play a part in bringing out the best in others, though, you ask yourself, what happened to them? How might I be contributing to the issue? And how can I help them? That's when you're practicing trauma-informed leadership. What I'm saying is that using emotional intelligence and trauma-informed practices can help you lead more effectively by building psychological safety and trust, across your team. It allows you to cover them instead of criticizing them.
How might I be contributing? Yes, thank you, Marie. That's a big one, right? And that can be hard for us to think, am I the problem? Because we go in to try to do our best, right? Everybody on this call, everyone who signed up for the session even, probably has the intent of being a really good supportive leader. And yet, McKinsey shows that on average, 70% of us are terrible managers. And so I'm sure nobody on this call, but I know I have, for some people, been a terrible manager because I just didn't know any better. And so the more we can become informed, the more we can be clear about how we're taking care of ourselves as well as our teams, the better we are able to create those new narratives and new ways of behaving. So, I always like, again, when in doubt, start with a question. So this is going to be another interactive opportunity for everyone. You can either put it in the chat, or I'm going to ask you to use something in Zoom called Annotate here in a second. But you can begin even with something small. If you see someone who is activated, instead of saying, you seem really upset right now, or is anything wrong, right? We don't want to activate shame. You can start with a simple question like, I need a glass of water. Would you like one? Or is there something I can do to make you more comfortable? Or just so I have it written down, who can I contact if you need someone safe to talk to? And just simple things like, oh, did you have breakfast today? Or anything, right? Because what it does is it helps us get that amygdala to move from overreaction and gets people thinking about something slightly different so we can move toward a place of calm. So I'd love to hear from this group of experts we have here. So if you go up to view options in Zoom and click annotate, you can select text and type in here a question that you like to use for connecting with others. If you don't have that functionality because your Zoom doesn't have it, feel free to add yours in the chat and I will copy and paste it over. So Coral, you can also participate in this one too.
Yeah, I don't think I have that annotate thing.
It's go under view options and then you should be able to see it there.
That's interesting.
Yeah, what can I do best to support you? Thank you, Jamie. Oh, I love that one, Judy. Can you tell me more about that? what did you feel you did well today? I love that. Thanks, Coral. Another one, I actually got this from somebody I worked with when I was working for the veterinary hospital company, which is tell me the best thing that happened today. And that was a great way to talk about that. Add your go-to question. I would have 3 so that it doesn't seem like you're a broken record. But have your go-to question. It just gives you a safe place to start, right? Oh, I love these. That was a great one, Jamie. Can you help what happened? What led you to that conclusion, or what evidence do you have that would lead you to that perspective? Okay. Thank you everyone for participating. So I'm gonna clear them out. Yeah, I love that, Jamie. Thank you so much. Okay, so if I see these things like avoidance, threats with authority, dysregulation, fear, shame, those survival responses of disengaging, here are some things we want to try to avoid. Telling people that they're overreacting, or saying, hey, can I talk to you for a minute? That's panic. Just get over and deal with it. Like you're just making excuses. Obviously, we wouldn't want to say that. What is wrong with you? I had the same thing happen to me and it didn't bother me. I don't understand why it's bothering you. You need to move on. Let's just not talk about it. That's another one to avoid. And these are things we may say trying to comfort someone. We may be saying them for all the right reasons. And we want to avoid things like dismissing. This is not your opportunity to share, to make this about you, right? So you can ask, would you mind if I shared an example of when I felt this way, if that is going to be helpful. But this is not an opportunity for you to share. Judgment, we're going to avoid that. We're going to become curious and we're going to become investigators, not judges. Ignoring the problem, big problem. It is not going to get away. It is going to get exponentially worse. Try to avoid becoming activated. It may be unavoidable. So that's why we talk about those self-soothing techniques. Again, let's avoid piling on and say, oh my God, well, you think that's bad. Blah, 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 blah. Again, we're trying to relate. These are things we're not doing to be mean. So think about what actions you will take based on the things that you've learned. I'd love to hear in the chat, what's one thing you're going to take away to apply to your practice? And feel free to come off mute.
I know one thing that I've heard some feedback on is attendance. How do you keep people who you know are coming from a traumatized perspective, that you're concerned that there is trauma, that the attendance is lacking because somebody is traumatized, and keeping them accountable to still be able to perform their job. They still need to come to work and do their job. Just because they have trauma doesn't excuse them from doing their job. And in fact, we know that people are much healthier when they're at work than when they're left alone and isolated. So, encouraging them to communicate on how it is that you can best help them perform at work, and be aware of what is their trigger, letting them share that and reduce the stigma, reduce the fear and shame about having trauma, and have those open conversations and say, what can I do to support your attendance at work? We really need you here on time, every time. Can we come up with a plan to support you?
Oh, I love that. Thank you, Judy. We'd love to help support you in that effort. So today's goals, recognize how trauma can show up at work. I think we've hit that one on the head, I think. Identifying some actions that you can take immediately, and then understanding some reactions to avoid. And with that, Coral, can you share a little bit about some upcoming work that you're doing?
Yes, I am so excited about 2024. I've picked some important dates to do some in-person training in Winnipeg, and we're going to kick it all off with the Trauma Informed Team Communications Workshop on January 17th. You'll be well fed as well because it's hosted at the Clay Oven. So lunch, a hot lunch is included from 12 to 4. And I will have some other registrations open for that one right now. You can go to my website at www.bettermentalhealthforthefuture.ca. And then as we go along, I will be opening up registration for the rest of the dates as we work towards improving workplace wellness through these type of workshops to help support leaders, managers, employees, anybody who's curious and wants to know more about how they can feel better at work, help their coworkers, their colleagues. And I'm hoping in 2024 we're going to create a movement because I have a goal. I want to help 100 practices by the end of 2025. So,
Excellent.
yes.
I believe
Yeah.
you can do that. I believe you can do that. Okay, let's open up any questions, comments from anyone about the topics.
Yes, so we're going to go through some learning about the Canadian standard and then those 13 factors I mentioned. Well, we're going to focus and hone in on that burnout component, looking at developing a culture by intention, and really circle back to that absenteeism, and then working on how to change from the inside out with the committee development. Hi, Jamie.
Hello. I just have a question with regards to trauma informed. So I know in Canada there's a number of organizations, I suppose, that do trauma informed training. And I was just wondering, like, if there are any that you would recommend in terms of certifications that people can take to become more trauma informed.
There's a couple of really good ones. It depends. Um, if you like, if you're looking for online, there's a company actually out of Winnipeg, although it's
Okay.
national, and in fact, I think it's North American. It's called Achieve, Achieve.
Okay.
Yeah, and they have some really good ones. Also, the Public Health and Safety Association, PHSA. I'd have to. I always get that wrong. There's so many acronyms in that, but the Public Health and Safety Association, they have one that is about trauma informed as well. And I'm trying to think if there's another one. Um, there's tons of resources at Workplace Strategies for Mental Health.ca. And there's tons
Okay.
of trauma informed training and resources there too.
But I would also say
Okay.
Coral has a workshop that is
Yes.
specifically for veterinary practices, right? So there's one I'd recommend.
Awesome. Self-promotion.
Thank you so much. I know, Jamie, where are you again? Are you in Ontario or BC or Alberta? Can't remember now.
So I was living in Calgary until last year. I'm now in Montreal, so in Quebec, actually.
Oh, really? Oh, that's exciting. The interesting thing about where trauma informed communication where it roots in actually is doing no harm in your workplace to your employees and the employer's duty of care. So learning about this trauma informed perspective actually it helps to protect workplaces against negligence when it comes to further injuring employees at work. So this is as an example, if you didn't know about trauma at work and how you could speak to an employee about it, and you just didn't actually, as a matter of fact, stigma took hold and we didn't talk about it, and then that employee got further injured at work and then has a firm diagnosis of PTSD. It is covered by workers' comp right now in many provinces. I'm not sure about Quebec. I got to think about that one. But PTSD is insurable claim, just like as if your employee broke their leg at work, you would call workers' comp and they would go on workers' comp. But if an employer is in the situation where there's a civil litigation, if the employer can't show duty of care in protecting the psychological safety of their employee, their organization is at risk. And the legislation is coming. It's already here, but it's not fully formatted just yet. And now it's honestly just probably months away. So, yeah,
I'm
lots of
going to
employers are making money off of that.
Oh, yeah. Well, and in the US, we have 32 states considering similar legislative acts in the
That's
state
right.
level. I want to address Tracy's question because I think mental health first aid gets it is a very specific training, and I want to make sure that we understand the difference. I love that you're interested in it, Tracy. So when I first became CPO for the veterinary hospital company I worked for, I became QPR certified. And so QPR, mental health first aid, this is about the same thing as CPR, but for mental health crisis. And so it teaches us how to identify when someone's in crisis and keep them alive long enough so that they can seek help, just like we do with CPR, right? I'm not going to perform heart surgery. I'm certified in CPR. That means I can keep someone alive until somebody else can address it, who knows what they're doing. And so the mental health first aid is really focused on people in crisis. What trauma-informed behaviors or practices teaches us are skills and competencies as both leaders and members of the practice, so co-workers in the practice, that are on the everyday, right? So not just when we're in crisis, but how do we create healthy and thriving workplaces that help prevent some of the psychological harm that can happen in the workplace. So the reason we talk, for example, about reflecting on the role that we play is so that we aren't part of the problem, because I'm pretty confident none of us want to be. You didn't come here to figure out how to trigger people's trauma, but more about how do I make sure that I'm creating a healthy and thriving workplace. And so the trauma-informed skills are pretty specific in that more of a leadership development capacity. But let me point out one thing and why this is important. The World Health Organization, their global guidelines for workplace mental health has 3 components. One is addressing the psychosocial hazards that can damage or injure our mental health, which Coral can talk about pretty cogently, and you have 13 that are identified in Canada. The second is to build skills especially for leaders, for navigating challenges, stressors, and things like we've been talking about today. And then the third is to have support for when people are in crisis. What's interesting about this, so we're kind of in that middle part. What's interesting when you look at the World Health Organization is the one investment you can make that correlates the highest to improve overall well-being in your practice is training the managers. And so the work that you did tonight, is in that second bucket and actually has been correlated to the highest and best outcomes. I know, very long answer to that question.
It's so true. It's so true. Thanks everybody for coming. I know that you've spent an hour with us, and if you're curious to learn more, you reach out to me anytime through LinkedIn or send me an email. And Dr. Al has some great advice and is so full of wisdom on this topic.
Well,
I'm
thanks
glad you could all make
everyone.
it. Mhm.
And we'll send out the recording and you feel free to share.